Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today because we are in the time of year where people are releasing their best books of the year. I love seeing all the different lists, kind of comparing the books that are sort of commonalities between all of the different lists and the ones that are kind of outliers, maybe discovering some new books. I just love it. And one of the top 10 lists that I look forward to every year is the Washington Post's top 10 books of 2022, because they have a fantastic book section and generally I think have pretty reliable taste in books, and they are pretty good about having a mix of books that you might expect to see on this list and books that are lesser known to you or maybe would be discoveries for you if you haven't been following along with their book coverage in particular. So as usual, there are 5 fiction books and 5 nonfiction books, and we're going to go through the list. I'll put a link to last year's reaction video that I did to their top 10 from last year in the description box down below if you would like to check it out. And we will begin with fiction because actually their list starts with the fiction. And I'm going to read the little blurb that they have with each of these books, and we will go from there. Some of these are lesser known to me, and there are some that are very familiar. Hopefully the same will be true for you. It's also kind of fun to see best of lists popping up this year, because this year there hasn't been a new book that I really hated, like aggressively did not like, and yet other people did really like, and it continues showing up on book award lists, best of lists, and just makes me roll my eyes every time I see it. There is not one of those books this year. Last year it was Patricia Lockwood. We won't talk about it any more than that, but it's nice this year that there isn't a book that I know is going to be on these lists and is just going to irritate me with its presence. So let's dive in and start talking about the Washington Post's 10 best books of 2022. The first one is Afterlives by Abdulrazak Gurnah. Abdulrazak Gurnah is a winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. I'll put a link to my reaction video from the year in which he won the prize down below if you'd like to check that out. This is published by Riverhead. Here is their blurb about it. Afterlives, by the winner of the 2021 Nobel Prize in Literature, is set in East Africa in the early 20th century. It demonstrates how gracefully Gurnah works in 2 registers simultaneously. The story is at once a globe-spanning epic of European colonialism and an intimate look at village life in one of the many overlooked corners of Earth. Deftly inverting the old Western narrative, it renders the Europeans as background characters and places East Africans in the forefront, moving fluidly between the complicated lives of its characters and the reckless actions of old empires. Now, obviously, we have been reeling from the effects of colonialism for a very long time, all around the world. Colonialism has impacted so many parts of the world. I'm kind of almost hesitant to say that there has been a part of the earth that has been untouched by colonialism in some way. And in many ways, we are still reeling from the impacts. And it's a difficult and complicated topic because, again, it impacts so many parts of the world. And the after effects of colonialism are very much important conversations to have. And it feels like they've been coming up a lot lately with the death of Queen Elizabeth II and things like that. So I'm not going to get into all of that now, but it is a very interesting and urgent topic. I think Abdulrazak Gurnah is an interesting voice for it. I have wanted to read one of his books since he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was an author I was unfamiliar with before then, but I wasn't exactly sure which book I wanted to read. This feels like one that I would absolutely enjoy and be interested in, and honestly that blurb of it just kind of seals the deal that this is definitely a book of his that I want to seek out, and I think this is the one that I would read in order to take a step into the literature of Abdulrazak Gurnah and then maybe explore further after that. So that one for sure is something that I would like to read. The next one is something that I am actually currently reading. It is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This is published by Harper, and let's do their blurb first. Equal parts hilarious and heartbreaking, Kingsolver's latest is the story of Damon, the only child of a teenage alcoholic in southwestern Virginia. In a feat of literary alchemy, Kingsolver uses the fire of his spirit to illuminate and singe the darkest recesses of our country. Inspired by the work of Charles Dickens, she has effectively reignited the moral indignation of the great Victorian novelist to dramatize the horrors of child poverty in the late 20th century. This would be a grim melodrama if it weren't for Demon's endearing humor formed by his unaffected innocence and weary cynicism. I think that's a great summation of this book and what makes it good. I am not finished with it yet. I am in the progress of reading it, and I'm a fan of Barbara Kingsolver as it is. I think this is a beautiful project that she has taken on, and I think the idea of updating David Copperfield and setting it within the foster system, which they don't talk about in that blurb, but it is set within the foster system in Appalachia, and it also very much deals with the opioid epidemic. It's just really smart. It's very empathetic. And it is heartbreaking, but yes, it is also funny as well. And it has really deep and profound insight into the characters. And I'm a huge fan of it so far. It could, if it continues in this road, break into the top 5 of my own favorite books of the year. I think it is very likely to do that. I'm a big fan of Barbara Kingsolver. The Poisonwood Bible is a spectacular book, and I would say it probably should have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I would love to see her come back now with Demon Copperhead and win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction next year. I would be very happy if that ends up happening. It seems like that could potentially happen, but the Pulitzer Prize announcement is 4 to 6 months away, depending on when they actually do it. So a lot can happen between now and then, and sometimes they don't like to think about frontrunners, and it does feel like she is quickly becoming a frontrunner. This is a book that I feel like is going to be popping up on a lot of year-end best lists. I would be shocked if it's not on the New York Times top 10 as well. It seems pretty undeniable at this point. It is a hefty book, but definitely, I would say, worth your time and your energy. And clearly the Washington Post agrees with that. The next book is one that I actually just heard about from an episode of the Kirkus podcast. Fully Booked, I think is the name of it. The book is Mecca by Susan Straight. The most recent episode of Kirkus's podcast talks about the best fiction books of the year, and this book was mentioned on that, and that was really the first I had heard about it. It sounds fascinating. It is published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Here is the blurb. By highway, the setting of Mecca is not far from the glitter of Hollywood and the animatronic joy of Disneyland, but by any measure that matters, it's light years away. Straight's characters are the backbones of agriculture, healthcare, and hospitality. People of color who work long hours for low wages. Straight tackles the way prejudice both motivates violence and distorts our response to violence. Between the poles of 2 ambiguous crimes committed 20 years apart, she strings the details of a terrifically engaging novel about a network of people related by blood, love, and duty. And that sounds really fantastic. I think I'm going to leave this open and try to see if my library or maybe Scribd has a copy of this book, because I had completely not heard of it until it was on that podcast that I mentioned. And I do think it is something that I am going to want to read for sure. So this will be one that I am going to seek out. The next one is another one that I feel like is predictable for best of lists for this year. At this point, it won the Kirkus Prize for fiction for this year. It's Trust by Hernan Diaz, published by Riverhead. Here is their blurb. Trust is about an early 20th century investor, or at least it seems to be. Framed as a novel, it is actually an intricately constructed quartet of stories. The first luxuriates in the tragic fate of America's wealthiest man, Benjamin Rask. In the second, Rask tells his own story. In the third and fourth, the testimonials of those who knew him reveal more of the truth. Diaz is interested in the way wealthy men burnish their image and how that process involves the diminishment of others. In summary, Trust might sound overcomplicated, but in execution, it's an elegant, irresistible puzzle. Now, a lot of people read this because it was on the long list for the Booker Prize, I believe. And the feedback on it was a little bit mixed. I heard some people, I don't know that anybody really just overwhelmingly loved it, but there were some people who liked it. And there were also some people who didn't like it and thought it was a little too much and a little too complicated in parts. Hernan Diaz was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize the year that Les won for a book called In the Distance. I have not read it, but he definitely seems like an author I would like to read. I did put a hold on a copy of Trust at my library, but when it became available, I was in the middle of some other things, so I kind of let it go and figured I would revisit it at some point. This does definitely feel like a potential Pulitzer contender again, so maybe this will be the competition for Demon Copperhead. I would love it if Night of the Living Res was the competition for Demon Copperhead, but I'm not in charge of these things. So it feels like this is a book that is pretty undeniable for best of lists. Again, I would be shocked if this one is not on the New York Times list as well, and we'll see how that goes. I feel like it's something I'm going to feel like I should read it in order to have a well-rounded view of literature from 2022, especially like American literature that could be a contender for the Pulitzer Prize. But some of the feedback on how kind of convoluted the book is made me a little hesitant, so maybe in the new year I'll get to it. I am interested. I don't feel like I'm as interested as the other books that have been on this list so far, being honest. The final fiction book is Young Mungo by Douglas Stuart. This is published by Grove Press. I did a whole video about my thoughts on Young Mungo back in February. I'll put a link to that down below as well. I am a huge fan of Shuggie Bain, and I really liked half of Young Mungo. There are two different storylines, and I thought one of them was a little too much, and honestly, I don't believe they fit together all that well because they're so close together in time. So you meet Mungo in the first chapter in the later time period chronologically, and the way it frames him doesn't make sense with where that second storyline ultimately ends, because it feels like it introduces him as a young, innocent, naive kid, but given everything that happens in that second storyline, I don't believe that he would still be that young and innocent and naive. I mean, it's possible, but that's one of the things that I mean when I say these storylines don't really fit together for me. Let's see what they say. Stuart's follow-up to the Booker Prize-winning Shuggie Bain is another masterful family drama set in the economic ruin of Glasgow after Margaret Thatcher's reign. 15-year-old Mungo shows the kind of vulnerability that makes people want to cradle him or crush him. The novel recounts his budding romance with a kind teenager named James. It also follows him on a menacing excursion outside the city with two adults. Stuart pulls the strings of suspense excruciatingly tight while still sensitively exploring the confused mind of a gentle adolescent trying to make sense of his sexuality. I do think it does that last thing well, the exploring the confused mind of a gentle adolescent trying to make sense of his sexuality. But I just think that one of the storylines is a little too much, and again, I don't think they fit together all that well. And although I think this book is different enough from Shuggie Bain, I would love to see Douglas Stuart branch out a little bit more in his next book and maybe not write another book about a tender-hearted young gay boy in Glasgow in the Thatcher era with a complicated relationship with his mother and siblings. I think, again, this book is different enough from Shuggie Bain that it doesn't feel like a retread, but I think in his next book, I would love to see him, even if he told a story about a tender-hearted young gay adolescent in modern Glasgow, that would be fun and interesting and a little bit different, and I would just like to see him break new ground on that as well. But I respect that a lot of people have loved Young Mungo. Some people think they prefer it to Shuggie Bain. That's totally fine. Book opinions are subjective. Personally, I didn't like it anywhere near as much as Shuggie Bain, but it's fine. And I'm not mad that it's on the Washington Post's best books of 2022. It's just not going to be on mine. That's all. Now we head into nonfiction, and the first nonfiction book is called Constructing a Nervous System by Margo Jefferson. Jefferson, a Pulitzer Prize-winning cultural critic, invites us to rethink our relationship with art while finding resonance in moments she shares from her own life. Shoving aside old ideas about memoir as mere biography, her approach is an almost poetic presentation of fragments of her experience as they ricocheted off artists whose work and lives she has found meaningful. She exudes charisma on the page with a voice that commands attention, drawing us into her thoughts about particular artists she admired in youth and then saw anew with the perspective of age. I heard about this book because I think it was on Time's Best Books of the Year so far at the mid-year point, and it's consistently popped up throughout the year on best lists, and just I've seen people really enjoying it. I'm not in a rush to get to it, but it does sound fascinating. It's published by Pantheon, by the way. And it's definitely something I would be interested in, but as someone who reads more fiction than nonfiction, I would rather get to pretty much any book on the fiction list that I haven't read yet before I would get to this. But I am interested, and I would definitely read it. The next one is something I had not heard of at all. It's G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century by Beverly Gage. This is published by Viking. And right away, there's a hurdle because J. Edgar Hoover is a sort of rage-provoking figure in history for me. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't necessarily want to read a book about him. So let's read the blurb. Gage tapped into previously classified sources to write this nuanced portrait of the man who wielded power within the Justice Department for an astonishing 48 years. Often caricatured as a loose cannon, Hoover was actually the consummate cautious bureaucrat, Gage says, the keeper of the files, an uptight, puritanical librarian. He was profoundly complicated, a racist who spent much of his career trying to break the Ku Klux Klan, someone who hounded American communists and used his power to face down Joe McCarthy. This book is an enduring, formidable accomplishment, a monument to the power of biography. And I respect that it's approaching all of the complicated sides of J. Edgar Hoover, but I think I would personally take a pass on it, at least for now, and move on to some of the other books on this list. The next one is The Petroleum Papers, Inside the Far-Right Conspiracy to Cover Up Climate Change by Geoff Dembicki, published by Greystone. Dembicki, a Canadian investigative reporter, has written a dark tale of money corrupting politics and paralyzing the public will. He shows how oil companies were studying climate science as a top priority during the 1970s. Executives were briefed and advised to act quickly to solve the problem. Instead, the fossil fuel industry acted to deceive the public, fighting a long war against the science of global warming, a science, ironically, that it had been instrumental in creating. For those who want a no-frills account of how we ended up on the climate precipice, this is an essential read. It sounds fascinating, it sounds urgent and timely and important. It would stress me out and make me angry, if I'm being honest. I feel like this is kind of where I'm sitting with Empire of Pain, the book by Patrick Radden Keefe, about the Sackler family and the opioid crisis. I feel like reading it is just going to make me angry, and ultimately there's not much that I can do to fix the problem right now. So maybe when there's a little bit distance, as long as the climate crisis doesn't destroy the world before I would get around to it, I need a little bit of distance, especially with the political climate being so fraught. I respect it. I'm sure it's a fantastic book. I don't think I could bring myself to read it right now. That's just based on my own headspace and mental capacity and emotional capacity for topics like this right now. It is what it is. The next one is Stay True by Hua Su, published by Doubleday. In this thoughtful, affecting book, Sue questions the possibility of meaning in tragedy. In college, Sue became unlikely friends with Ken, whose mainstream tastes and interests couldn't have been more different from his own. Ken was murdered early one morning in 1998 by robbers who were strangers. Sue describes the aftermath with devastating emotional precision. But while tragic, Stay True also succeeds as a wry chronicle of the insecurities of youth and of college life and culture during the 1990s. With warmth and humor, Sue has produced an extraordinary devotional act of friendship. I do need to read a true crime book before the end of the year for Montana Book Company's Reading Challenge. It's one of the books that I talk about wanting to try to fit in before the end of the year. I'll link that video down below as well. So that sounds like the kind of true crime that I would be interested in. It's much more focused on the victim and the impact of the crime than it is about sensationalizing the perpetrator of the crime. I'm going to circle back to this and see if that book might be available anywhere, just on the off chance that it is. And maybe that's something I'll fit in before the end of the year because it fits something I need to do anyway. And it sounds like a type of true crime that I would respond to. The next and final book on Washington Post's 10 Best Books of 2022 is Weapons of Mass Delusion: When the Republican Party Lost Its Mind by Robert Draper, published by Penguin Press. And I can tell you right away, even though I feel like I'm inclined to agree with what this book is doing, I feel like, again, like Empire of Pain and like the Petroleum Papers, this is probably a book that I would just find myself enraged with. Not necessarily with the book, like the anger wouldn't be targeted at the book, but it would just make me angry and frustrated to read it right now. That again, that's me. I fully support and understand anybody else who would like to read this book right now. I'm also not the type of person who was watching Outbreak at the beginning of the pandemic because it would have stressed me out as well, but I respect that a lot of people were. It is what it is. Here is the blurb for this book. In this vital, indispensable book, journalist Draper elbows his way into the right-wing crowd in the halls of Congress. He starts with the insurrection at the Capitol, offering a startling level of new first-person detail about that extensively covered day. In his rigorous reporting, Draper is drawn to individuals who speak and tweet opinions far outside the alignment with reality. He treats his subjects with empathy, even when he's disputing matters of fact. But the abundance of deceptions he compiles adds heft to the ultimate point, that Americans' combative relationship with the truth has made us vulnerable to any outrageous lie. Yes, I feel like this is something that would really just stress me out right now, make me angry and frustrated. Yeah, I haven't been on Facebook since the 2016 election because it feels like there are people who want to believe the untruths, and it's very difficult to navigate trying to have a conversation with them, and frequently it feels like howling into the wind. You know, you might as well do that. You'd probably get further yelling at with the wind than you would having a rational conversation with people who want to believe these lies. I think it's important to have those conversations, but my capacity for them has diminished because it feels useless so often. So I fully respect this book. I'm sure it's fantastic and interesting and all of that. It is not something I would be able to do right now. Again, it is what it is. I would love to hear what you think of this list, what you think should have been on the list that might not already be here. If you're vibing with any of their choices, let me know in the comment section down below. I think for the fiction list, personally, I might take Young Mungo off. It wouldn't be in my top 5. You know, I'm not going to say I would take it off because I know a lot of people have loved that book, and I think that's fine. I understand why that's allowed to be. I would have liked to see Night of the Living Res on this list by Morgan Talty. I'm a big fan of that book, and I have been very happy seeing people discover that book and enjoy it as much as I did. So I would have loved to see it in here. I'm trying to think of other books. I love Don't Cry For Me by Daniel Black. I feel like a lot of people have forgotten that book. It was published very early in the year. I love it, so it's something that I would put on my list, but I'll get to do my list toward the end of the year. I usually do my list in January because I wait until the year is over, like definitively over, before I talk about anything that I have, the best books that I have read in a calendar year. So in January, you'll be hearing my list anyway. But those are 2 books that I would have loved to see in this mix. And I'd love to hear what you would have liked to see as well in the conversation, in the comment section down below. And as always, I really appreciate your time. I'm really looking forward to the New York Times 100 Notable Books, which should be coming soon, and the New York Times Top 10 Books of the Year as well. So stay tuned for those. And as always, I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.